When we search for reasons why Abbey Road is great and it has maybe a special place with us in our hearts, the medley has to loom large. I mean, obviously it has Here Comes the Sun, Something, Come Together. Those are winners on any record, but it's the medley that has this certain kind of symphonic power. Now, they called it, during the making of the record, the long one, and they did that for a reason, because it was long. And it was mostly the studio personnel who would call it this. Alan Parsons called it the long one. Whereas the Beatles themselves called it the huge medley. Now we call it the Abbey Road medley. But of course it doesn't have this name. It's simply a medley of tracks that conclude the record. And the idea had been with them for a little bit by this point. It was George Martin who said that he wanted to get them to try to compose something larger, something symphonic. Something that had different parts that would run together, change keys, move contrapuntally. The keys were very important.
What makes a good medley? Just a bunch of songs strung together, anyone can do. But one of the things that makes this medley really good is there's a tonal center to them. There's a tonal movement. It starts out in this kind of very sad key of A minor, and you end at the end of the end with C major, this triumphant key. And the medley, in some ways, is a movement from A minor to C major. It's transitioning through various related keys and ending up at C major. And it's kind of really cool how they construct that and make that work.
And it has, and I can say this because I'm an English major, it has a kind of Shakespearean quality, certainly with the couplet that we'll talk about a little bit later, but it also moves through the 7 ages of man, like As You Like It, all the world's a stage, right? Moving through youth, into adulthood, into the trouble and strife that comes with friendship and pain and growing up and growing older. It's really all there. It's almost Blakean, as in William Blake, to a certain extent.
So most of the material in the medley comes from, again, 68 and 69, songs that the Beatles, in most cases, had worked on. They had done versions of and tried to figure out the arrangements, and it just, for whatever reason, never finished up. And so when it came time for the medley, most of the songs had dated back some as much as a year ago, but they just hadn't finished them. So let's bring them together and see if we can find a way to thread them together.
Now, you said that the medley begins in a kind of darker tone. There's a reason, and it introduces it in You Never Give Me Your Money.
Yes. So You Never Give Me Your Money, and I know you're going to talk about this, but it really, this is Paul's song. And this is Paul kind of putting into music and words his frustration with some of the tension at Apple right now and tension with the Beatles. And there is, without going into a long discussion about it, there's 2 camps in the Beatles. There are some who want to have Alan Klein as their manager, and then there's Paul, who wants to have his father-in-law as the manager. And there's a lot of accounting issues. They've created this thing called Apple, then they've had to shut most of it down. These are things the Beatles never had to worry about just 2 years earlier when Brian was their manager, and now they have accountants coming into the studio and lawyers coming in. They're getting into fights over business issues, not necessarily musical issues. And I think Paul puts a lot of that into this song, but he takes it and says, here's my frustration, here are my problems, but let me take you on a path out of here. So
he does elevate it, as you suggested. It's also a through-composed song. Another example of that would be Happiness is a Warm Gun. These are songs that never repeat themselves, right? They're made up of very discrete sections that don't come back. There is no chorus, for example. Well, what about Mean Mr. Mustard? How do we get to these kinds of songs?
So these are songs that start back in their time in India in '68. John brings this one back, brings back Polyphonic Pam, does some demos of them for what are called the Esher sessions before going into the White Album. Nothing much happens from the song. They don't work on it during the White Album. It brings them back during the Get Back sessions. They work on them. They do arrangements. They try to chorus. Never really goes anywhere. They're left on the shelf, resurrected for the medley.
And the same thing is true for Polyphonic Pam, which was not her original name, right?
Well, so there are 2 stories, one of which is that there was a woman from the Cavern Club days, Pat Hodgett, who was known for eating plastic, and they called her Polythene Pat.
We all have our thing.
Yeah.
Hers was eating plastic.
That's one of the several stories about how Polythene Pam came, but it's a great two John Lennon characters. Just he was so great at this. I mean, this is the stuff that was in his books as well, where he could write these funny stories. These are two little vignettes about me, Mr. Mustard, Polyphonic Pam, both deriving from some stories he had read or stories he had heard, people he knew, and then making it as John Lennon always did, into this kind of fanciful, kind of interesting story.
And he would later sort of poo-poo these songs, but what they do bring, despite those remarks, is a kind of character, right? Suddenly there are characters, just like Rocky Raccoon or the Nowhere Man or Eleanor Rigby. There are these people who populate these Beatle worlds. That's why they're like great stories in so many ways. Sort of like the great story of She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, which literally somebody came in through the bathroom window in Paul's Cavendish Avenue home. He lived very close to the studio, as you can see on this map here. And of course, the people who came in were the Apple Scruffs. Yeah, what was their story?
So they were these young girls, these fans of the Beatles, who would hang outside Paul's house, and they loved to sneak in his window, steal little knickknacks, maybe just rearrange them to say they were there. And oftentimes Paul would have to come up to them sheepishly and say, "Hey, I really like that, that thing that you took from me. Would you give it back?" And they would give him back something, so.
Well, in fact, the one in the case of She Came In Through the Bathroom Window was a photo of his father. What's the story behind Carry That Weight?
I have no idea.
That was very honest.
Carry That Weight starts again in the Get Back sessions as something that Paul is whipping off, and it sounds like a funny song. He's writing it almost like a Gilbert and Sullivan song. He's playing it for Ringo. They work on it for a while, again, resurrected, and it takes on a much more somber tone as part of the medley here. Boy, you're going to carry that weight, all of this, the weight of everything that's going on at Apple right now.
Right, there's going to be a burden, right? A lifetime, perhaps, of that burden you will carry of remorse and the things we say and do to each other. Very sobering. Even Paul's admission, I never give you my pillow, which seems, perhaps on first glance like a kind of silly line, but it's not. It's a suggestion that I could have given you comfort or be a better friend, but I chose not to. And that's a heavy weight indeed. Well, if you have a great medley, and certainly we do, you've got to end with a song called The End. And you all should have known, especially you original Beatles fans, that it was all over. When you have a song called The End on the last album, that means we're out of here. It's like Cream's last album, Goodbye.